A word about the importance of France and specifically of Paris before we take a look at Modigliani. I want to remind everybody that France is going to dominate the art world from roughly 1650, the middle of the 17th century, to roughly the middle of the 20th century, about 1940, which happens to be the time that the Nazis will take Paris. With the destruction of World War II and the upheaval of World War II, the geographic location of Paris is going to lose its premier position in the art world as leader of the art world. But from the 17th through the 20th centuries, middle of each, the Parisians were in charge. The French create the National Academy of France first in 1648, and that's going to set standards for quality and taste. From that point forward, um, other countries are going to look to France for the trend setting that occurs and just some of the styles that will come out in that period, beginning with French classical Baroque, which is a part of the 17th century. We're also going to have neoclassicism, we're going to have romanticism, and of course, by the time we hit the 19th century, we're going to have impressionism, we're going to have post-impressionism. Art Nouveau was born here. This is also the center for Art Deco. So it becomes a leaping point for new styles, new ideas. They begin, well, Paris is the center of the art world here, and then they spread out to other regions. The School of Paris specifically refers to a group of artists, not necessarily working in the same style, but a group of artists, often international in scope, that happen to be drawn to Paris as a base for creating their art and growing personally as artists. The School of Paris is generally thought of somewhere from 1900 to 1940. Again, 1940, the date when the Nazis will take control of France, but also specifically of Paris. And it does refer to Paris as the center of the art world for modernism, because this is where it all happens. And just as one important example, I can give you Picasso, who is a very young man in his 20s, leaves his homeland of Spain. Where does he go? He goes to Paris. Even though he can't afford to be there, he knows he has to be there. This is where it's happening. This is where the great works of art are developing. This is where you can see what is happening and therefore grow and participate in it. That wasn't the only reason, though. Paris was an incredibly modern city. It was multicultural, it was exciting. It had the Eiffel Tower, and it also had city lights, so that it was considered to be a happening place, a modern place. And if you were an artist, it was absolutely the place that you had to be to prove yourself and to establish a reputation for the rest of your life, which is what Picasso was able to do here. It was also a city that had the likes of Braque, of Leger, and certainly also of Matisse. A number of artists all working in their own styles or in different variations of group styles such as Cubism, but nevertheless, by being there, being able to exchange ideas and stimulate the growth of other artists at the same time. So think of Paris as the art center of the world, but also think of it as a place for artistic and intellectual exchange, which helps to promote the growth of modernism. Within the School of Paris, there is a small group of artists that have come to be called the cursed. These individual painters and sculptors lived in relative poverty. They had, I'm going to say, an attraction, a fatal attraction for the world of cafe life. They were alienated from middle class values and they lived a bohemian lifestyle. Many of them lived short lives and some of them tragic lives. And I think that Modigliani is going to fit into that category. If you take a look at the dates that I have on the screen, you're going to be able to see that he does not live a long life. Modigliani is going to die in 1920 at the age of 36. I have two photographs so you can get a little bit of a look at him. The young and relatively healthy Modigliani, who is also a kind of good looking guy, on the left. The image that's at the bottom on our right is the year of Modigliani's death. And I think you can see that, generally speaking, living a life of poverty as well as dissipation has taken its toll on Modigliani. He was involved with the consumption of alcohol and of drugs. He never had enough money to really live a comfortable life, and he was known to be in cafes or cabarets where he would make a sketch or perhaps a limited painting and actually pass it out to see if he couldn't get enough money to buy a glass of wine. So he is one of these quote unquote cursed artists who did, in fact, have a tragic life and a short one at that. That is also going to apply to the women who were part of Modigliani's life, which I will refer to shortly. Despite the upheavals in Modigliani's life, there seems to be a calmness to his art. And I'm going to suggest that about his friend Soutine, which is one of the many portraits that Modigliani has left behind. This is Haim Soutine, and it's a picture that was done in 1916. That would be specifically the painting on the left, which I just had a chance to look at. And if you also get a chance to look at it in Washington, you'll be able to see that the surface is very rough. The paint surface is rough and uneven. And in fact, the paint doesn't actually cover the entire surface of the canvas, but it's actually broken up. It is a painting that is abstract, but at the same time gives an accurate representation of what Modigliani's friend actually looked like, and it characterizes him. That's the thing that's kind of cool about Modigliani. He's able to, with abstraction, give us a character study of the people he paints. And he has left behind a number of portraits of artists as well as friends who were willing to sit for him, Soutine being among them. Soutine is from peasant stock. He's not a member of the elite, and you might be able to determine that just from looking at him. He's got a kind of sturdy build with rather large hands. He seems maybe a little nervously clasping his hands together. He is asymmetrical in his features, and his hair is a little disheveled, as is the jacket and the collar. And we're talking about the work on the left in particular, so that it looks like he isn't terribly concerned about his appearance. He seems to be a little bit on the unpolished side. This is typical of Modigliani's approach to painting portraits. The figures are usually placed facing us against a plain background. There's also a sense of elegance that's achieved in Modigliani's art through the use of elongation. And I think you can see that most pointedly in the neck of Soutine, located right here. Or if you want to go over to my other example, you can find it there as well. Those elongated features are also outlined. Modigliani often uses line to convey form, to enclose form, and his lines tend to add to the elegance of his subjects overall. The line of Modigliani's images also suggests that he was aware of Art Nouveau and some of the moving and elegant qualities of Art Nouveau design. He was also very aware of African art, and that shows up in the simplified elements of form. And if we just go back here, if you take a look at the broad cheeks of the face, there isn't a lot of modeling or light versus dark, but everything seems to flatten out in a simplified and broad manner. That is one of the influences that can come from looking at and studying African art, particularly African masks. The end result for images like this is a product that is elegant with decorative qualities, particularly of line, so it's very linear. It has an aristocratic elegance, even though Soutine is not a particularly aristocratic subject. Generally, there is elongation of the figures, most notable in the neck, and the faces tend to be somewhat flat and mask-like. In addition to that, often the surface of the canvas is very rough, filled with heavy and thick paint applied unevenly, often, in fact, leaving patches that are not covered at all. In many ways, summing up some of the experiments of modernism that were taking place in Paris in the early part of the 20th century. These are two more examples by Modigliani. Let me draw your attention to the one at the top left. That is Picasso. Modigliani and Picasso knew each other, and that's one of the benefits of being in Paris. You can see what everybody is doing, and you can get to know the people who are breaking the rules and actually becoming successes. The photo on the bottom depicts Modigliani with Pablo Picasso. If you look at the Modigliani portrayal of Picasso, the thing I'd probably like to draw your attention to is the piercing black eyes. And that was one of the hallmarks of Pablo Picasso. The intensity of his personality came through in those eyes. The image on the right is of Modigliani's lover, mistress, common law wife. She lived with Modigliani. They never married. She was a painter herself, but she was frequently a model for Modigliani, so she was an artist's model. This is typical of Modigliani's images, very elegant with a flowing kind of curvature to the elongated neck, continuing up into a curving form for the head. He gets us to focus on the form, partly by not actually filling in the eyes. So we tend not to be looking directly at the sitter or perhaps having the sitter look directly at us, but we get a sense of elegance of the overall form of the depiction. Continuous kind of flowing weaving lines throughout this. This particular lady, I have to assume, loved Modigliani deeply. The day that Modigliani died, she was brokenhearted, and the next day she threw herself out of a window, committing suicide. When she died, their unborn child, she was several months pregnant, their unborn child also died. This is part of what lends itself to I'm going to say, the reputation of the cursed artists who had tragedy in their life and lived a life on the edge and a life that was filled with poverty as well. Despite all of the difficulties that she faced living with Modigliani, that painting of his mistress is another example of an image that appears to be calm, balanced, and ordered. It's as if he's suppressing all of the difficulties in life in his paintings. Now, the Picasso is an exception, and I think all of the agitation in the Picasso painting that Modigliani did is a testimony to the energy that was a part of the personality of Pablo Picasso.